Thanks for meeting with me. And I want to start off with context on what we're going to be discussing today. So, after an extensive playthrough and playtest, I recorded a review of your training simulation. And I wanted to follow up with the man behind the software and go in depth as to what you and your company are doing. So, really quick for everyone, I want to do an intro. Speaking with me today is Tod Langley, a military man, advisor for the Active Shooter Prevention Project, CEO and founder of Crisis Response Leadership Training, CRLT. Him and his team have developed a training simulation called The Incident, along with a learning management system. It's a gamified approach to crisis response training. So it's played out as a virtual tabletop, turn-based crisis management and response, real-time strategy solution. And it's designed to support a multitude of organizations from the top all the way to the bottom and bottom to top. And what I mean by that is incident and scene commanders, emergency management professionals, guard force, first responders, single responders, community leaders or executives down to employees. And I think this is really important because when there's a crisis, community leaders and executives are the first individuals everybody wants to hear from, right? So that's why this is such an important training simulation. And then, of course, some training professionals and, of course, volunteers as well. So the simulation trains crisis critical and strategic thought, improving decision-making skills, and I like to call it a high-stakes chess match with real-world consequences. So I hope I did your intro justice. But if you'd like to go in more depth of your background in the company, or should we just get started?
Well, I'll give a brief overview because I don't necessarily like to talk much about the background, but maybe it'll help to see where we're coming from, what our motivation is. I don't have a law enforcement or first responder background. So really what I have is an appreciation and desire to help our communities based on what I went through. And it was really mainly a military background, infantry, soldier officer, intelligence officer with some company commands, National Training Center, senior observer controller. 9/11 happens, and like many, I didn't want to be, stuck where I was probably in a staff preparation, during the time of war kind of consideration. I couldn't think of that. So I did put in some packets and was picked up for a sensitive capability in support of our Tier 1 special mission units, and did singleton capabilities for what we would call close tactical reconnaissance, hostage rescue, and clandestine activities, particularly against high-value individuals in the war on terror. Then became a troop and battalion level commander during combat, and made mistakes, as a leader. Mm-hmm. So that's important to me in understanding, hey, we had a lot of great successes, but when you make a mistake as a leader, that has ramifications, and it can, mm-hmm. people can be demoralized. They can have lack of communication that can affect the success of the mission, and really, it could lead to loss of life. Now, thankfully, no one was ever, harmed based on my mistakes. I'm not trying to make them sound egregious, but we learn, right? And we gotta ensure we do better. So after I left that as a major, became a civilian as a contracted senior advisor to another at the time special mission unit, the asymmetric warfare group. I became their senior advisor in intelligence to the group commander, and then all of the sensitive activities being conducted for the organization, as well as becoming the senior troop advisor for one of the troops in the operational squadron. So in that time period, unfortunately, between being active duty, working special operations, and then with AWG, I had about 11 and a half years of combat deployment and 6 years in actual combat. And again, a lot of witnessing of what happens when there is a disconnect between leadership training, leadership execution, and what happens on the ground. And I've seen the worst of what can happen, and I've seen some of the best. And I'm trying to put those together in a way that can hopefully resonate with our community leaders. And then after that, not as if that wasn't enough already, toward the end of my careers, this way. I became a liaison back to one of the special mission units, and eventually transitioned over in the intelligence community through one of the three-letter agencies that non-disclosure, I can't say it, but I became the high threat team leader for terrorist operations in a couple of different countries, and then became the senior cadre for a part of the pipeline for the selection and training process. And in all of that, I guess, Jared, come back, and what I'm really saying in that is that there's luck, there's training, there's preparation, there's commitment, there's a lot of things that go into it. And time and again, what I saw as I started my own consulting about, I don't know, maybe 6, 7 years ago with local law enforcement and federal agencies and even some Fortune 50 companies in emergency management, the same issues I saw with the command and staff of a military organization in a combat or conflict were pretty close to the same type of what I call friction points of what any emergency management, first responder, incident commander, unified commander, or leader of an organization that has to deal with safety and security of employees and people on the property, the friction points are very close to being the same. So what we wanted as a philosophy to start off with in creating crisis response leader training at the end of 2019 was to say, well, what are those friction points, and how do we promote awareness and education and training that allows us to realize those and then do something about it to create greater proficiency, for when something like an emergency or crisis occurs. So that's kind of the background on it. I know it's long-winded, but I hope people understand what it is we're trying to do and why we want to do it. The worst thing to me is seeing innocent people suffer, right? Because of evil. And I definitely believe in evil in our world. And what it means that when we could be saving lives or preventing harm to innocent people, because we haven't thought through what really needs to go into the details of having leadership or employees better prepared. That's just bottom line. That's what we want to do.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. I do see a lot of parallels between a crisis response and the responsibilities of leadership and military operations, similar to a TOC or a COC in the Marine Corps. That tactical operations center ingests all the information, analyzes that information, disseminates the information, as well as coordinates communication and resources and things of the like. So when you talk about those friction points, we will shortly discuss some of those biggest challenges when facing crisis response. So before we get in, if you don't mind, I do want to paint the scene with a few crises. And I used a tool called Bard, which is Google's large language model chatbot, similar to OpenAI's ChatGPT, to draft 2 scenarios to kick off our discussion. So excuse the theatrics, but
I'm gonna like it. Let's hope
these scenarios.
I
hope you do. All right, so here's the first scenario. Anticipation hangs in the air as the clock's hand creeps closer to the hour. Pencils tapping impatiently against desks, and the rustle of turning pages fills the silence. The bell rings, chairs erupt, papers fly, textbooks slam, a symphony of release. Bodies surge towards the exit. A human wave crashes into the hallway. Backpacks collide, laughter bounces, hurried goodbyes fizzle in the excited throng. The tranquility shattered, replaced by the deafening crack of gunfire. All right, so scenario 2. The company office fluorescents light shining brightly. Keyboards clicking, pages rustle, and the clock ticks closer to its midday chime. As it sings, anticipation crackles in the air. Chairs roll back, planners are tucked away, and a low hum of chatter rises. The lunch break exodus begins. Bodies stream through the hallway, greetings exchanged, lunch plans discussed. Suddenly, a sharp yell pierces the comm. Heads turn, curiosity turning to concern, as the familiar buzz of lunch break shifts to something more sinister. So I know this is a little bit corny, but necessary in order to segue into today's discussion around CRLT and training using the incident. So being a crisis response training simulation and simulator, I want to start by asking, and you had brought this up as some of the friction points, but to start, What are some of the other examples of crises and crises locations, as well as some of those biggest challenges faced for crisis response and management?
Well, as other type of risks, there's a whole spectrum when you talk about risk assessment or risk management. And that really would it's called a threat or risk spectrum, and you talk about what is likely versus what's the impact of those type of things. It could be from a simple slip and fall on the ice, right? Are you based on something from OSHA, is there something you should be doing there, to something a little bit more standardized in requirements like a fire evacuation drill with accountability of personnel, on the exterior as fire rescues coming on the scene, to natural disasters, right? Typically, if it's common in anticipation of your area, there's an expectation that's included in your emergency action plan for response also. And then certainly you could get into things we've seen in the last 2 years, like civil unrest and what that means to, rioting, and what that means to property damage. You're always going to have a potential threat of something happening that might be more violent, like an armed robbery or domestic violence spillover. Those are certainly concerns, to include workplace violence. And then more than likely, unless we're talking something really bad, like a serious hazardous material incident or nuclear war, really the active shooter event is probably really at the high end of what significant impact it would have to an organization. Low likelihood of it occurring, right? Probably less than 1%. But if it does, it'll forever change the landscape of that organization if they're even able to recover. Most, unless they're very huge organizations, they won't recover. So you really got to look at in design of awareness and preparation. Do you understand the total risk spectrum? And then are you able to rank the likelihood of those occurring and what impact it'll have upon you as an organization? And it could be based on, what's that mean to the well-being of your employees and your patrons, to what it means to financial liability. How much are you going to have to pay out in insurance based on negligence in comparison to, do you have any criminal negligence, based on what occurred? So you would look at those things, and that's really kind of the spectrum you look at. So one aspect of it in the worst case scenario is an active shooter incident. I would argue, though, if you can do your response and protocols and your planning and preparation as an organization, whether you're a first responder or a corporation, if you can focus on your most dangerous, right, you're more than likely already including and incorporating what you need for the more likely things to occur.
Right.
Now, when you talked about what that means in terms of something like what is a challenge, what I would, or what is a challenge with understanding a crisis, the way I look at it is an incident's an incident. It's going to occur no matter what. That is your risk as it occurs. The emergency is what follows based on the priority of what it means to saving life and limb, right? That would be your emergency. And what's the scale of that going to be? Now, your plan should incorporate the emergency to anticipate those things and be able to handle it as efficiently and effectively as possible to save life and limb and property. When you have a crisis is when the event exceeds your capabilities to handle it. So it either goes beyond the resource capabilities you have to, respond to the emergency, or it means that you did not plan for it and it's an unintended consequence, which also means it turns into a crisis. What you want to do within your emergency management process and your risk assessment in developing a plan is try to ensure you never get to the crisis point. Because when you get to the crisis point, that's when it's really going to make an impact to your organization or to your community. Mm-hmm. Now, when you talk about what do I think is the greatest challenge overall, what I see right now, and I'm going to call out what I think are the challenges. It's just Todd's opinion, but I'm going to try to back it up with a little bit of statistics. I think the problem right now is that we have not shifted the paradigm in our ability to ensure preparation, because you can understand that the ability to save lives, if it's like an active shooter event, is really going to be determined on what you do probably within the first 2 to 10 minutes. And over 50%, probably more like 65% of that is based on what the organization does without first responders even being on the scene. But certainly the end point of that, you're going to need first responders to help you. The problem we have right now in societies is that we are way too oriented on a compliance check of training rather than a true a validation of our preparedness capabilities. And here's an example. Violence is up in most categories, particularly victimization, as well as what it means to our young adults, right? Violence against the 20 something young adults is significantly higher. Um, Active shooter events, it looks like a hockey stick, right? We had
Right,
it's
right.
climbed year over year, and certainly the last 8 to 10 years, it's not good. It's getting worse. So there are preventative things we can certainly talk about, but that's probably not where this conversation is going right now. Um, we've also got 15 to 20% reduction in law enforcement capabilities. It has jumped up about another, I think it was about 40,000 employed in the last
Hmm.
year across the nation in this. But overall, you've got, you had defunding movements, you had protests, you had calls for cultural change, you have reduced morale, you have shifting career emphasis of younger people that don't necessarily see law enforcement as a career. There's a lot going on
Yeah,
there.
interesting. Yeah,
Uh, By the way, what I also throw in there is you have about a 20% turnover rate per year in most employment categories. Law enforcement's no different.
yeah.
And it's very
Yeah,
similar K through 12 as well.
yeah, and I wonder with budgetary constraints what that looks like on the vetting process as well. If they're trying to hit these manpower numbers in recruitments, are they lowering the vetting entry standards
Oh
as
yeah.
well? Cognitively as well as physically.
We're anecdotally, I would say that that's very true, and your
Hmm.
thought is spot on. We are seeing reduction in standards. We're seeing it take much longer to get people through
Hmm.
the pipeline because a lot of people, one, the number of people submitting applications to being screened is much
Hmm.
lower. And then the candidates that do make it through, they've got a higher dropout rate of not being able to make it through initial
Hmm.
academies or certification. So
Yeah.
we've got that on top of it. Um, and like I said, with the 20% um, kind of turnover rate, you could just use that as a multiplier of like a 0.2 factor. That's what I want to do. So that's
Yeah.
just as an easy example.
Hmm.
Let's say that there's 708,000 law enforcement in the United States, and they're a primary first responder training audience. Let's then add in the 3.5 million teachers we have in the United States. So we're at
Hmm.
about 4.2 million, right? And if we talk later, maybe about what does it take to ensure preparation off of the cognitive things,
Yeah.
let's let's say easily we need four addressing of drills to functional exercises of skill sets in a year. Okay, so now you can tell that that total training audience requirement on an annual basis is 16.8 million training that has to be completed across the United States per year, right?
Right. That's a lot.
Okay, so now take this. I'm not going to name them.
Hmm.
I have friends there and I respect everything they've done. And they are the national standard. They collect important data and they put out very important policies, best practices, and everything in the law enforcement realm. On their website, they indicated that they've trained over 300,000 people in 20 years. That's
Okay.
1.7% of the annual need, and it took 20 years to accomplish it.
Yeah, that's low. And are we talking about initial training or sustainment training?
It's initial basic. Well, that's a good question. I don't know, honestly. It could, they've got a basic course, they've got a civilian course, and they have a newer incident command level course. So it's a combination of all the above.
Right. And I
And
think I
but
think it's
typically,
pointing out that there's gaps regardless.
there's a
Right.
huge
Huge
gap. So
gap.
let's
Yeah.
even say with, because they're not the only ones responsible. There's other
Right.
national entities, there are local and there are state initiatives that have to take it up as well.
Hmm.
And I don't have that data, but if that's the track and we added
Hmm.
that all together, I don't see how we're training more than 20% of the requirement across the board in just the K through 12 to first
Right.
responder network for
Hmm.
incident command. And like I said, if
Yeah.
we've got a 20% turnover rate, I, I think it's hard to argue that we're even close to where we need to be to
Right.
ensuring, greater response capabilities. Nothing about the prevention
Hmm.
side, but just on the response side, we're nowhere close to where we need to be.
Right.
And
And that
just
plays into what you were talking about being proactive versus reactive. in these scenarios.
Yeah.
So with that being said, I'd like to bring it back to the training aspects, right? We're talking about getting these critical individuals trained, and with budgetary constraints, timeline and time frame limitations, which can obviously, as you brought up, statistically can compromise the quality of training if there is any, which ultimately trickles down to real world. Right. So just like any pro sports team or a world renowned chef, it's all about practice makes perfect. And we're both military guys, repetition, repetition. And when I was in the Marine Corps, we mastered the basics through repetition and sustainment training, that famous crawl, walk, run method. And for simplicity's sake and time's sake, in this explanation, there's this recurring training at all levels. However, we would train from the bottom up in like this pyramid shape, right? So we're talking about individual Marines, marksmanship, small unit leadership, TCCC, combat casualty care, that self-aid, buddy aid, shoot, move, communicate. Roll into a company FTX field training exercise, into a battalion war games, and then culmination of multi-unit training readiness exercises to include air, ground, and sometimes naval assets, ultimately leading to the combat deployment. So it seems like there should be some sort of similar approach in training for a crisis. However, organizations don't have the time nor the budget to perform these collaborative events that span multi agencies using traditional methods like the DoD does. So how does one kind of bridge this gap? And it's kind of a leading question.
No, it's good,
Yeah.
and it's hard to pare it down, succinctly. At least for me, I
Mhm.
told you I was a talker.
Mhm.
So in the national references, what you just described is in there. The degree of complexity compared to a crawl, walk, run,
Mhm.
in combination with different training types, starting off with seminars, workshops, tabletops, or drills, tabletops, scenario-based exercises, functional exercises, and full-scale exercises. That's written into the language of what's recommended through DHS and FEMA. So that's there, and through things like, if you understand HCEP and those kind of things, that's there, and that's typically utilizing the federal government level, pushing down to certification of your county emergency management agencies. So that's there. On the other side of the coin, though, if we say that 60% of things are really based on success of what happens on the ground before they are able to take control, who's running that and how's that established? In, like what you said, in a cost constrained environment where time's important. And it goes, Jared, a little bit into I call it the old guard, new guard. A little bit off topic here, but I think we have a problem in the security industry right now where we have two opposing viewpoints, where we've got the old guard is like, hey, look, we've got policies, we've got procedures, we've got the data to back it up. We we can do in-person training because there's nothing more impactful, just like you've and I've been in it. For me, there's nothing
Mhm.
better than doing live fire CQB, right? Where
Right.
you might even incorporate, at some point we would actually incorporate live role players inside of a live fire CQB. Nothing is more stimulating than that. Um, but you obviously can't do that very often. And how long does it take? Like we talked about, if you can only reach less than 2% of the training audience, that that's not going to work. So the new guard on the opposite side is, well, we've got innovation, we've got technology that saves time. It's remote. But I'll be honest and saying too is like, well, there's a skeptical audience because a lot of it's just being pushed for high dollar amounts for startups, and it doesn't necessarily always answer the problem. That's going to look self-centered, and it's a new approach that's really been overall within society untested. I think the problem is that neither one's the right solution, but together they're a right solution.
Mhm.
We need a combination of in-person instruction,
Right.
possibly as a start point, and then we need recurring training that's of value through scenario-based training that allows us to increase our knowledge retention. Again, maybe cognitive, overload and what it means is a later part of the discussion, but we need something that allows us to increase awareness, education, and
Mhm.
preparation over like an annual basis.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think something that's important is what you had brought up, that explicit to implicit. The classroom instruction, the period of instruction. in-person demonstrations, collaborative discussions, rolling into a field exercise, that practical application, which is more implicit because you're exploring a dynamic environment, and then of course ways to test knowledge retention and then recurring training, and I truly believe that the integration of technology can replace that the implicit side of training, the virtual sandbox that your system provides. So I think that could be a solution when trying to appease both sides and integrate technology while keeping in mind budgetary constraints and time limitations.
Well, in that, to get it and hone in on the point, let's
Mm-hmm.
talk about if you're doing in-person training on an active shooter incident that combine all the county level assets to include the school resources that or personnel that needed to be in it. I participated one. It was about 2 years ago, but I can tell you with the labor categories and the amount of money they put into it for 2 hours of training, and we're only every officer only got 4 hours of training. And the officers in that part of the training, what did they receive? Identify, neutralize a threat, and shoot, no shoot, target discrimination capabilities. And then certainly there's a little bit of discussion on casualty collection point. Nothing on triage, nothing on TCCC, nothing on recovery, anything like that. There was bare minimum integration of what it meant to the school faculty and the rest of the county in doing that training setup, and that cost them over $60,000 for 2 days of training.
Yeah.
Okay, for just 2 days, not repeated.
Right.
Now you take it in the middle, and there's another training opportunity that would be hybrid. So let's talk about the opportunity to utilize federal grant dollars, and you could get somebody that can bring in tractor trailers full of computers to set up a temporary lab. They have probably the best instructors, most qualified incident level command, unified command level instructors you can get, and they will tailor it to where it's a combination of the same thing, but now you don't have to go all over the place. You're in one centralized location for the training, and you step into like an outline on a floor, and you're like, okay, I'm now seeing this as the superintendent or whatever. That used to be, as of last data I was able to pull, is about $70,000 for 3 days of training and training about 40 to 50 people one time. Now go to the opposite end of where you can have a gamification capability that would give you scenario-based training to augment the original in-person training. And let's say you even want a custom level of your own property in there for 5 years of individual to multi-participant level training, as many times per year as you want, to include a custom level. You could get that amount of training for the same price.
Yeah, that's
So,
incredible. And I could just
right.
imagine how dynamic the simulation is in a multi-agency environment. Because I really play tested primarily the individual modules and single participant. I didn't dabble in any of the multiplayer collaborative effort scenarios. So I could just imagine how complex that could be, as well as the discussions that are going on during these centrally located scenarios.
Yeah, some of those, just like the first set and scenarios you talked about, even just the first one in the hallway, which automatically
Mm-hmm.
my mind went to Parkland. But imagine it being, okay, we went from single participant where we have kind of that sixth sense of automatically knowing what all the other responders would be doing at that same
Mm-hmm.
time, right? In a multi-participant session, you don't necessarily know that unless you force communication, which is
Right.
huge. What if you set up an initial entry point and tactical command in one location to control flow and entry into a facility, but another responder decides he's going to come in from the backside of the building? That's an easy example of integration and synchronization of assets. What if ambulances refuse to move out of the cold zone staging area where you're trying to communicate that we're establishing medical staging where we've got a casualty collection point going on and we're ready to start inbound, outbound ground evacuation,
Mm-hmm.
but we don't have communication with them because they're on a different band. So those things come up because we have integrated dispatch. So those things absolutely come up in the multi-participant.
Yeah, that's interesting. This makes me think about blue on blue in the military side. Individual units operating in the same AO as another unit who don't communicate with each other. There isn't that higher echelon of communication, uh, within the COC or the talk for the Army. And I wonder what the statistics are on blue instances or incidences in those situations. So, in parallel, yeah, these multi-agency organizations, that communication and the training and the experience in a sandbox virtual environment to put you in those situations will really bring to light that coordination.
Yeah, and I think at least what we try to do in that sense, not to get into core features yet if you're
Mm-hmm.
not ready, but
Mm-hmm.
statistical probability of outcomes, because we are talking something like a turn-based tabletop functional simulation. What we try to do is to make sure that our hybrid AI is really replicating real world statistics as accurately as we can make it. So on that one, when you talk about the potential for fratricide or not understanding your backdrop to an instance that might be in the way, unfortunately, in a firefight, uh, for responders in the U.S., this common statistic put out by the FBI's active shooter bulletins is that 80% of rounds will miss their intended target. So if you want to say, well, we're going to do multiple entry points to rapidly identify and neutralize a threat, you can do that as long as you understand the risks that are with that. And really, we don't promote and telling you what you should do as a standard or best practice. We're just going to replicate what could potentially happen to you when you make those kind of decisions.
Right, right. Yeah, really know your target and what lies beyond it.
Yep,
And
exactly.
since you brought it up, I think we can talk about, and roll right into the simulation itself. So recently I recorded an overview review of the sim. And if anyone hasn't seen the video, I have it posted on my LinkedIn, CRLT's YouTube page, or on the championspath.net. So first, I really want to dive into the framework, essentially the scaffolding, if you will, for the training program, which is quite unique, right? So it's a 3D environment, real-time strategy, turn-based, gamified crisis response training sim, but it's developed on Epic Games' Unreal Engine, and I think aside from Unity, it's one of the world's largest game engine right now. And we're talking about the same engine that brought us Fortnite, Final Fantasy VII, Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order, Street Fighter. I mean, the list goes on and on.
Yeah, even a lot of your screen replicate replacement with computer generated graphics right now, like the Mandalorian, owned by Disney, but it is created with the backdrop of Unreal Engine. The same with like the last Rose Bowl was used, live video production. So we're a big fan of Unreal.
Yeah, so the reason why I bring this up is because we're talking about future proofing, right? You've built the system on and your software on a world renowned game engine. It's scalable, giving you guys creative freedom to build really customizable scenarios that are client specific. It has a huge community that's consistently engaging with Epic on updated improvements and has world class AAA support. So what I'm saying is it's a strong game engine that's not going anywhere anytime soon.
Yeah. No, and we are a two-time recipient of what's called the Epic Games Mega Grant, which allowed us to get into our initial, early adopter and start to make our way out of early adopter. So they have that, and they have that, like you said, community behind them, and we have an assigned technical manager. And whenever we have a technical challenge or we want to reach in within the community of other grant recipients, we have a strong network and communication pathways, and that allows us to build and save time too. We don't have to always trial and error every single thing. If Epic has already done it, they'll research and they'll come back and tell you, a best practice to get over the hump.
Right, right. Yeah, that's incredible. And so when I'm thinking of, game engine that produces AAA titles like Star Wars, I'm thinking, okay, I need the hardware to meet the specific requirements, right? State of the art graphics card. I need lots of RAM, fast processing, local hard drive storage. But CRLT, if you don't mind going into, has a unique solution for that. Do you want to elaborate on it?
Yeah, I mean that's a really good point because even traditionally, as we all think about any type of video game or application of a simulation product, it's typically been viewed as a download as a software support capability to a local machine. I mean that a client would have their hardware and your software programs installed on their computer, whether it's a desktop, laptop, whatever. Now it's going to have minimum performance capabilities to run something like a video game, and that means it's going to have a dedicated graphics card. It's going to have a certain amount of RAM for processing with the motherboard. It's going to have a certain amount of data storage to retrieve from. So it has those capabilities, and CRLT would be no different. And we actually, our baseline product when we started was for that. Now, what we try to do to optimize our simulation and reduce those hardware requirements, you're not spending $3,000 on a dedicated laptop just for a simulation, is reduce that as much as possible so you can at least get a lower entry point on like a medium, entry of a laptop.
Yeah.
So what we also do on top of that is, because we're turn based, you're not doing a lot of live processing power like you would in a first person Call of Duty game. Keep in mind that when we talk about when you talk about strategic chess, we're looking on top of the scene down through the character's point of view, so that creates the atmosphere and understanding for real problem solving. And what that also allows you to do is, because you're pulling out, you don't have to have the very detailed facial capabilities and everything else. So our performance and what's called level of detail is scalable. You can zoom all the way in. You can actually go into a first person point of view in the replay, and then you can zoom back out to scale of that kind of seeing the scene. And when you change those level of details, that changes the optimization settings to allow it to continue to run smoothly. So for us, our ambition is always to keep it at 60 frames rate or higher in processing per second. And certainly sometimes we get it up to 90, which is where we'd really like to be for our VR plugin capabilities. Now, on the opposite side, in technology, where it's going and what it means to accessibility is, do I really want to spend more money on having a dedicated machine for this training? And does it limit me to only being where people can access that machine? Why don't we have a remote full cloud-based capability so I don't have to worry about inventory and accessibility? And we feel, in coordination with Amazon AWS and Epic, that we are one of the first, if not first, as we are seeing right now, 3D simulations for emergency management and incident response is coming out. And everything that you've seen that we have on the standalone versions, I think you've tested some of our internal server capability. Well, we're in final benchmarking with Amazon AWS. This is completely cloud-based to include the voice channel communications and dispatch. All of it's there. There's no price change on it, really, based on what we see. It's about the same of buying the hardware versus doing cloud-based, but now it can be accessed from anywhere, pretty much based on the demand signal you have of how often you want to access the program.
Yeah, that's incredible. And from my experience, I started playtesting, I want to say winter of 2022. And I started on my Surface Pro 7 laptop, which is a 2019 model. And then I would jump between my desktop and laptop, depending on where I was and how long I wanted to dedicate to the session. So you're absolutely right. As long as I had a device, I had a stable internet connection, even in a hotel, I could run the software.
Yeah, and that, as we move into some initiatives we're excited about, hopefully closing soon and getting started on, this makes it to scale in how you can organize not just the crawl, walk, run, but what it means in kind of like, maybe in business terms you call it enterprise approach. But imagine, what's the best way to describe it? Maybe start it at the highest level first. If you could imagine that there would be federal agencies that would dictate kind of what should be your minimum standards for establishing training management, training strategy associated with incident response. And then really that would probably guide your funding application through the states. And then the states will funnel the money downward based on grant applications. Now at the state level, you could have the state entities of agencies in conjunction with academic institutions. And now the academic institutions are polling for their region or nationally, they're pulling the data and saying, okay, this is what we want to look at from an applied research perspective. This is what we want to do with promoting micro credentials for degree completion, or reaching out like to pull data from end users. And then imagine at the lowest level, maybe the county, and then down to independent school districts and local responder units, Imagine each one of them having the capability to get in on that and them all being linked together if they want to share data. If they don't, then you just turn off the connection, and that becomes proprietary information to the unit. But if you want to share the data, now you have a data collection capability linked directly to your learning management of your testing knowledge, as well as your simulation performance, which should help us drive more policy and protocol decisions in the future.
Yeah, that's important. I'm here in North Carolina, and one of our state action plan objectives for school safety is to strengthen the capabilities for response to incidents of school violence. So I have a couple of their objectives here for brought up from North Carolina Department of Public Safety. And for time's sake, I just condensed some of these to 3 single bullet points. And these are objectives 4.1 through 4.3. And the first bullet point is enhance training to prepare agencies for immediate no-wait active shooter response. That includes a single responder. And then the second is implement active shooter preparedness and mitigation initiatives for school personnel. And part of that is to determine if all students and staff are conducting active shooter training, as well as recurring training. And then the third is strengthen coordination between schools and responders. So similar to that pyramid, I brought up earlier that task force collaboration efforts to test training readiness. So my state is, and I would assume, like you had brought up, the entire continental U.S., all states are focusing on a similar approach.
Yes and no. I mean, it was good to hear what you said. I've seen that in a couple other states. Some, I would say, are making emotional-based decisions that are kind of knee-jerk, where they'll just mandate a specific, solution. Like, hey, you have to have vendor X, and you have to do that. So they're kind of shortcutting it, and I won't get into the politics or the lobbying capabilities with vendors that's what it might be. But what you did say in there, and what I think, at least what we are trying to do, we didn't read the tea leaves. We're not, all we did was look at what I asked my team or our team to build was, hey, look on lessons learned. How do we build the strongest thing we can? And at least 2 out of 3, what I heard you say was, something about data tracking to your training management and what that means to the validation of your preparedness. And the other one I heard was holistic training. So what we did to balance that is, you can imagine if all we did was create a replacement for a tabletop, what's the utilization of that for an organization? 3 times per year if you're lucky. Now, to me, changing up the description, understanding there's a difference between a tabletop and a functional exercise and a full-scale exercise. Side note, I tell you right now, is we're looking way too much at tabletops as being validation, and they do not validate, right? We've got to get leaders to understand a tabletop does not equate to validation. So that's a problem. But beyond that, again, if you only used the simulation 2 to 3 times per year, and I came to you and said, well, we can get you a starter package. You won't get a custom level, but you can get a starter package for under $6,000 with cloud services. You might say, maybe. But what we did is to say, well, there's got to be an individual component to this. It's really where you start with your crawl and some of your walk stages. So what are we doing for individual employees,
Right,
up to managers? And we have modules. So we have things in association with our partners like the I Love You Guys Foundation. We're an authorized tech licensee for them for simulations. So we have lockdown and reunification, and we're getting ready to build many more. We're also getting ready to come out with one for at least the K through 12 space. Well, it will show you for facility manager, emergency manager, and superintendent, what does risk assessment to an emergency management process look like? We have another one for school resource officers. So the idea is we're increasing content that you can utilize for all of your personnel that they could revisit 1 to 4 times per year as you build up towards these quarterly exercises at different levels. And what we've incorporated that we think is unique and somewhat on our intellectual property is we have a system that every time you make a decision, whether it is through your learning management testing of your pre-knowledge, inside your individual lesson plans, inside the tabletop or functional exercise capability, we have data hooks. All that data is stored and ready for export for analyzing. So you can look at trends. A great example is on your time to react and call 911 compared to when you can do ground evacuation. How do we shorten that window? And what does it look like in analysis compared to what's called the golden hour, which gives you the greatest chances of survivability, at least statistically. And that data is there for analysis. So I can use it for compliance tracking. I can use it to assess whether or not the comprehension of individuals and teams is higher. I can also demonstrate what it means when I'm actually integrating with the rest of the community in a more holistic manner.
And I think since we're talking about that, I think maybe we can go into the training simulation itself and discuss some of the game mechanics, and then we can get into the weeds as to how the simulation is presented. So I like to call it high stakes chess match with real world consequences, and I assume most everyone knows how to play chess, so I won't get into the minutia of gameplay. But there are a few important similarities, and just for context, I play chess every day in my free time over at chess.com. I even wrote an article on why you should play chess every day.
It was
So
a
when I
good
was,
one. I
yeah,
remember.
I
Yeah.
appreciate that. Yeah, and it's by far one of my most popular articles that I've written too. So when I was running the scenario, I found that it had a lot of similar game mechanics as a turn-based chess match. So Todd, if you're okay with it, I'd like to do a quick, fun comparative exercise where I give you a chess mechanic and a brief explanation, and then you can
Okay.
correlate that to CRLT's The Incident training sim.
Oh, this would be cool. Yeah, let's see.
Yeah. So the first is strategic thinking and anticipation. And the basis for strategy is information and knowledge gathering, as well as what to do with that information. So one of your core, what are your core knowledges, your experiences, and from the start of the match, you're also gathering your opponent's gameplay style. So are they willing to sacrifice pieces? Because some people, uh, avoid the loss of pieces at all costs, and then others on this spectrum try to kamikaze you into a checkmate, right? So with your core knowledge and information gathering, an advantage in chess is also knowing the probability of moves. So what does a likely opening scenario look like? What is my opponent's next move, as well as several moves ahead, and what are counters to those moves? So I believe that there's a lot of direct connection in this mechanic in crisis response training simulator.
Uh, that's really cool. And when I think about at the high strategic level of impact of something like chess and what we're trying to do in CRLT, I got a good friend, retired chief of police for Lafayette PD, Pat Flanley. And he probably came in and told me at first off, was like, hey, you gotta link this more to consequence management. And I kind of was like, what the heck does that mean? But what I think it means in terms of the high stakes chess capabilities is understanding the the orders of impact of your decisions. So if I want to topple the king in a checkmate, how many turns is it going to take to do that based on the input from the other people? And what does it mean if I make this move? Well, what does that mean 10 turns down the road? And what we're really trying to show there is that there's a first order impact to a second order to a third order at a minimum. And people that have been in training have certainly heard that kind of thing before. What I equate it to is an easy discussion of what does that mean in phases like what alert might say in phase one, stop the killing versus stop the dying versus recovery. So if I'm thinking about that, and I'm still in my initial approach to an entry point as the very first responder to a scene, I'm also technically the incident commander. Yeah, I'm probably worried mostly about my own personal safety and saving innocent lives. But what I do in the first 2 to 3 minutes may also set up success or failure for the first tactical commander, the incident commander, on simple things of just like how am I reporting information. Now, for us, I tell you, you're a little bit at a disadvantage because you're not going to see all the chess pieces 100%. You only get to see what your responders would see or what you get through reporting from your 911 call. So it's really going to try to force you into making decisions with an understanding of what you got to do right now versus what the impact will be, of that several turns down the road.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting with the critical decision, because I think another trait and characteristic of chess is critical decisions with limited resources. So in chess, a lot of strategy hinges on making decisions based around this thing called material. Um, it's basically the value assigned to each piece on the board. So every piece, the pawns, knights, bishops, all that has a unique move set as well as a specific value attached to it. So a pawn is worth one material, while a knight is worth three, a queen is worth nine. A bishop, however, is also worth three as well as the knight. So right, so you have different functions, but the same material value. And you only have a finite amount of material in chess, right? You only have a certain number of pieces. So when I'm playing chess against someone, I keep an eye on this hierarchy of pieces, this value of pieces, and I have to make critical decisions with limited resources. And so it helps me figure out how well or not so well I'm doing in the game. How does my resources, match with my opponent, as well as how are my pieces on the board itself, the position of the pieces. I only have one queen. Where is it at on the board? Is her placement in its max effect? Am I strategically developing my bishops to support her? So, is there any correlation to CRLT's the incident in that aspect?
Yeah, yeah, some. And what I'll say is that what's unique, maybe not the same, is that what we have to understand is that any person could or should be a leader at some point in time. So it's kind of like you've got defined roles within chess, but who is operating each one of those roles can switch at a moment's notice based on requirements. But as an example, in what it means to limited resources within the sim, is we have a fully functioning dispatch that's linked to Google Maps with live traffic updates. And what it'll do is randomize is your local law enforcement patrol officers throughout your jurisdiction based, and then when they are called out through the general 10 code or whatever it may be by dispatch, it'll route to the scene based on live traffic updates. So rather than saying, in typical tabletop fashion, oh, I've got 50 law enforcement and, 4 fire truck pump, squads or whatever it may be, and this is what they're going to do. It's like, well, okay, that might work 12 minutes from now, but you've only got this at this time. So it'll introduce you, and some of that's randomization. It'll be randomization based on time of travel, speeds and the traffic and those kind of things. But also it's also limited based on what you have within your jurisdiction or what you have on what's called mutual aid compact capabilities from the surrounding agencies. So you're going to have to deal with what you need to do what's right in front of you with the resources you have right then. So that's one thing is kind of a correlation.
Yeah, and with those limited support, the next is pressure of time constraints, along with emotional control. But I think more importantly that the pressure that you're under the clock, right? And I'm going to explain this really briefly because I really want to hear your thoughts on this. So in most chess formats, there's a game clock that adds additional pressure, limiting the gap between the start of your turn and when you make your next move.
Yeah.
So what does this do? You need to make critical decisions quickly, and of course, avoid emotional reaction, which could cloud your judgment. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, we don't do that well yet, but we are working on it. Now there is some stressors in the end state. If you understand what you're trying to do is to save as many lives as possible, what we have incorporated into our hybrid AI are significant data tables, which with each data table probably having 100 data points to it. And all that's based on national level research. So as an example, the mass morbidity studies of wounding from gun violence from mass attacks in the United States by the American College of Surgeons. I think that report came out in 2018. Really good data on the type of weapon used compared to the wounding type, the location of the wound, the severity of the wound, and the time to expiration of the victim or patient from that. All that data is within the simulation. So as an example, if you're making a tactical decision of law enforcement to clear and then back clear after neutralizing the threat before you allow in some type of capability to support triage and casualty collection, and that costs you another 5 minutes, what does that mean to the time period you have for ground evacuation to get them to, let's say, a level 2 or higher surgical capability to stop them from dying from their gun wounds? So there is that kind of intrinsic understanding. These people can die on you in the simulation if you don't get them at least off the scene as rapidly as possible with your critical decisions. But we also have in some of the sims, and I don't know if you played it or not, but in the SRO Casualty Collection Point 1, we have a countdown timer on it. And the countdown timer will stop you in the training if you don't get to, I think it could be 35 or 25 minutes into the 60-minute countdown.
Right.
Essentially, it's what it's saying is like, hey, look, these people are probably more likely not going to make it because you didn't start ground evacuation with enough time to get them to that level 2 care. Would you like to continue or do you want to start over? So there's that pressure of the countdown clock in that manner. Now, in the future, what I'd love, I'd love to get your feedback when you get the time to play it again, where it'll be is like, hey, look, for every character that you're controlling, you get a certain amount of time to make a decision. And if you don't make a decision for that character in that amount of time, then you lose that turn for that character and it'll jump you to the next character.
Interesting.
And we'll do it
Yeah.
that way.
Yeah. I had a similar scenario where I had a third order effect that I wasn't anticipating. So when I first ran a sandbox scenario, and this is why I know that it's so important to get these customized locations for site specific purposes. I didn't have any issues with subduing the threat or treating the wounded, but I had a logistical nightmare in the parking lot, right? Police cars were everywhere. I had multiple fire and ambulance vehicles scattered. And of course, there were vehicles already in the parking lot because, why not? Why wouldn't there be cars in the parking lot itself? So it was a cluster. I had to pull personnel. To get the vehicles out of the way. I wasted so much time and several turns when I had urgent surgical needing to get to the hospital for long-term care. So it was definitely something that I wasn't anticipating being my biggest issue going into a scenario.
Well, I try not to be overly critical because I am a strong supporter of our first responder community, and particularly what's happened over the last 2 years. I wanted them to know I've got their back. But if you look at lessons learned and what we need to talk about when we talk about between the branch chiefs and what it means to the incident commander, unified commander, look at what media is usually able to capture. And what are they looking for? They're looking to capture chaos. And often when we talk about the exact same scenario you experienced, that's captured all the time. I can probably name 2 to 3 right now of case studies of where that was a particular problem. So yeah, well, I'm kind of glad you experienced that because that's exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to pose the most critical problem, and challenges that you can face in this, and trying to push that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
it was definitely frustrating, obviously, due to my lack of foresight. But I'm glad I was able to see that weakness in a SWOT analysis of the scenario. So we've talked a lot about the simulation itself, the foundation, this high stakes chess match. But I want to go into cognitive load. It seems like there's a steep learning curve. How is it presented? Is it how natural is the training? And what does my retention look like? So cognitive load is really in its simple explanation, just your mental capacity to process information, right? And everybody has a cap, right? It's the brain power bandwidth. So I like to use the analogy of bringing in the groceries as a simple explanation, and all men can relate to this, right? So you've got 30 grocery bags, 2 arms, challenge accepted. But how effective, how efficient really is this method? Am I going to look like a sumo wrestler? Is it going to be incredibly awkward trying to waddle with all these grocery bags? And it's definitely going to be uncomfortable. I may have to put some bags down along the way to the kitchen, like Hansel and Gretel putting down breadcrumbs through the forest. And in regards to the simulation, is it the 30 bag 2 arms challenge? From my experience, it's definitely something that's overlooked a lot with these training simulators. So here are my thoughts, and then I'll turn it over to you. So my experience with the incident, the information was presented very comprehensively and chronologically. And I touched briefly on this in my review. as far as the explicit to implicit approach. I had course material, virtual reference guides that I could refer to either expand or reinforce my existing knowledge. There were pre-tests to test my existing knowledge. And then, of course, the individual modules, like you had brought up. And these are the way they're presented is very explicit periods of instruction in bite-sized chunks, right? The what to do's, why to do's, when to do's, what not to do's, for example, lockdown procedures and casualty collection, like you had brought up. Then I went into a single implicit scenario where I was given a location, an initial 911 call, and I was just given the reins in a sandbox scenario to command and control as I saw fit. And with its simplistic user interface and tutorial, I was able to really focus on what was important, running through the crisis checklist. And then once I was done, I could conduct an after action in AAR, as well as test my retention with a post-test and then self-assessment, which you can save, timestamp, and then track future progress.
Yeah, that's so I think some of it's important in understanding way back, probably even, I don't know, 150 years or more. Dr. Ebbinghaus was I think a psychologist or psychiatrist, and he did a study on what's called the forgetting curve, which was linked to the learning curve. So essentially it's that idea of I've got a very steep learning curve, which can be good because it means it's new information and that's stimulating the brain for understanding. I'm going to plateau, and then it's going to start falling off. And what he did through studies and what's been common practice in this cognitive overload capabilities is understanding that probably within 30 days, you're going to lose 70 to 90% of what you're taught. So imagine that you've only gone once in your career to incident, of something related to incident response. You've only done it once. It was 40 hours of your butt in a seat, and you got your certificate and you put it up on your wall. And then when are you ever going to use it again? You've lost 70% of your application of that or your retention of that. So Ebbinghaus also suggested that within a 3 to 4 month period, if you revisit in certain windows that same information, and then you at least repetition wise, you're going to gain a higher retention rate. Now, what we combine on top of that philosophy is, okay, got it. If I give you frequency of engagement, higher retention, that's not really good enough, particularly in days where you got competition of time and other resources. So if we make it what's called complex adaptive, i.e. the crawl, walk, run, we start you off in easy difficulty, medium difficulty, hardest difficulty possible, and we throw at you different scenarios. That's complex and that's adaptive. That's focused on critical problem solving skills with frequency. So now you've got frequency and engagement, and activity is going to increase your knowledge retention even better. So that's a philosophy of what we have. Now, what I think is also unique to what we're talking about is what learning management is not just, I don't want people to think, okay, at the beginning you get pre-test. Right. Now you got individual training, you got the sandbox or, the exercise capabilities that we have in the sim, and then you go into the after action review and the post-test. No, we took it a step further and said it's based on data hooks and event triggers. When you make a decision within the simulation, it's linking that back to your learning management and saying, hey, what did Jared get right or wrong? And was there at least a question presented to him in one of the quizzes that is affiliated in some way to one of the decisions he made? And if there is that correlation, it's going to give you that as a recording, timestamp that for the automatically recorded replay. And now you've got a free camera to go in your after action review. And not only are you looking at it and saying, well, what happened? But now you've got a facilitation prompt that says, well, this event occurred. And I like using the example of someone died of a sucking chest wound. And underneath it might be something about the use of a vented occlusive chest seal, dressing, occlusive dressing. And it'll say, and it will talk about that in comparison to hypertension pneumothorax. God, I'm saying it all wrong.
Yeah, but hypertension, pneumothorax. Right? Yeah, sucking chest wound.
I'm having word problems today. But right. It'll tell you about that, and it'll give you a correct answer to what you had in your pre-test. Now you can use that for facilitated discussion capabilities. And when you go into the post-test, it's like, okay, I had testing my pre-existing knowledge. I did something in the simulation experience that drove a challenge that I had to focus on critical problem solving skills. And when I went into the replay, that visual stimulation and review, along with a best practice or something from the learning management, was brought up again. that should help shorten that time period that it takes to increase that retention capability.
Yeah, that's interesting because as a user, I would like to compile that data and then understand trends within my own skill sets and my own reactions within the simulation. And I'm glad that you brought that up because I definitely didn't do it justice with my explanation.
No,
Because that is important. Those data hooks are important, especially when analyzing and tracking recurring training.
so there's actually really good, I know we're
Mhm.
waxing on and it's my fault, but you know what? I really wanted to look at the national introduction to the rescue task force and what that would mean in shortening the timeline for ground evacuation. The more immediate your care and the more rapid your evacuation, the more likely you are to save lives. And that's backed up. There's some studies in Berlin. I even talked to somebody that had experience with Baltimore ER and what their survivability rate is, with gunshot victims right now at 93%. It's phenomenal. So we looked at those and looked to apply that to what that means statistically. And one of the things we're hearing is about, well, you got to get the RTF in and started, to get your triage, your ground evacuation done at about the 15-minute window. And we just use that as a benchmark and said, what happens if we analyze the data you're talking about? I took over 6 months of me utilizing the simulation, and I get it. I know the user interface very well. I have fairly extensive background in emergency, situations in the past, so I get it. But what I did see was with our hybrid AI and the statistics that we're utilizing is that I did see when I used the combined rescue task force of law enforcement and qualified EMTBs inside the warm zone, and what that meant to doing that, if we started that under 15 minutes, our survivability rates of the ones we could save based on the type of wounds they had, we increased our survival rate by 50%. And that goes right in line with, like, at least we're showing from a single user's perspective and applying it to, scenario-based training, the data reinforces what the national standard said to do. And I don't know if it's coincidence or not, but we're certainly trying to get that out to everybody and saying, well, let's look at the data and let's take, at least we're utilizing that as a background for our discussion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's another unique aspect of what the simulation incorporates into these realistic situations, which are and the outcomes through artificial intelligence as well as NPC response behavior. Do you want to go more in depth on that and
Yeah,
what
sure.
users could experience throughout the scenario?
Yeah, and it kind of goes back to the mechanics. So it's a turn-based capability where you control whoever you decide to control, and we have a large pool of, and we'll continue to build up on it. But you can control teachers, faculty members, employees. You can also control the school resource officer, law enforcement arriving on scene, fire and rescue, and EMS. So far, once you've made the decisions for each of those, what would happen within their turn-based capabilities, let's say it's a 15-second turn or whatever it may be, then it would shift over to the hybrid AI of the threat. And the threat's behavior currently is based on a lot of different publications, to include the U.S. Secret Service National Threat Assessment Center look at the behavior of active shooters in the United States. That was recently published, I think published about a year and a half ago. So it'll look at all that and say, okay, based on what you said, which is your action, my reaction of the threat is this. And then once those two are complete, it will then say, okay, well, based on what you called NPCs, the non-playable characters, or the civilians or innocents, what are they going to do based on behavioral reactions of run, hide, fight or flight, auditory exclusion, their distance to the target, and how much they can hear, because we have all of the auditory requirements of the AI are built in there as well. And it'll say, what are more likely they're going to do? And we have them programmed, and this will be sensitive because I got to make sure I say it the right way for what our partners stress. Like, what does it mean if you are in a run, hide, fight capability, and what that means to prioritization of running out and evacuating the location to get as far away from the facility as possible in comparison to something like a lockdown? So you can toggle that behavior on for comparative analysis in the sim. And you can do it off the baseline product or your own customized level and say, based on where I'm at, is lockdown appropriate? Does it look like it's saving more lives compared to the other? And so we
Mhm.
have all that data built in there to be able to take a look at and say on an action, reaction, counteraction capability, turn by turn, what's more likely going to happen.
Mhm. Yeah, and I did notice scenario by scenario, um, the NPCs did operate and react differently, especially to my um, to my inputs as well as the threat. So that yeah, it was very robust. But let's see. I think we're running out of time here, so let's conclude if you're okay with that. And then, of
Yeah.
course, if there's a discussion on a topic of crisis response management, virtual simulations training that the community is interested in and could benefit from, we can always link back up and discuss some of these micro
I'd
topics
love
in the
to.
future.
I would.
Yeah. So just real quick, what is the vision of the future of emergency management training, and how does CRLT software play a role in shaping that future?
Well, the future really is unlimited. I mean, we talked about the capabilities of the game engine. We've heavily modified it for our own use, but if it's physics-based rendering capability that can be done through computer graphics, it's feasible. So that really means that we could, take a full gamut of risk capabilities, whether it is civil unrest, violence on property to include workplace violence. We could de-escalation. We could take it into a mid-spectrum of what it might mean for like an industrial fire that maybe includes potential for hazardous materials. We can look at, and we've seen interest in the DoD space, and particularly what it might mean to aircraft incident management compared to crowd control. And we think that maybe the FAA and airports would be interested in that as well. So anything to be transportation oriented would have another interest in it, right? It could be our railway systems to shipping lanes, and then you take it to the other, farther in. You can take it to natural disasters. You can look at the Weather Channel and find examples of Unreal Engine being used for real time rendering to demonstrate what it looks like now compared to what it'll look like with a hurricane tidal surge coming in on top of the reporter. So there's a lot of capabilities there to include first person integrated virtual reality.
Yeah, I've
You know,
seen that. That's interesting.
so we did that almost about a year and a half ago. We demonstrated through one of our partners. We showed that, hey, you can do incident command level tabletop and functional level exercises, and you can pass data back to a virtual reality of the same environment, the same AI capabilities, but work on individual and team level, tactical and judgment and decision making at that level, and pass information back and forth real time between the two simulations. So, and we have that capability. Now, short term, how do you bridge that gap? How do you get from one to the other? We're really just coming out of early adopter. We're tech innovators in the space. We really want to help out. We're reducing costs as much as we possibly can to get some client base that will give us feedback to make it even better. And certainly, our orientation is to listen to the clients and do what they want. What that means for us right now is that gaining traction allows us to build out stability of the development team and then orient on the initial client base first. Right now, that's K through 12, law enforcement, fire and rescue, and kind of your EMA at the county level, but really oriented on like the facility level capabilities. Once we have that, it's really based on where's the next demand signal. I would love to see it go into where we can start supporting more of like a regional level concern. Let's say county EMAs linked into a natural disaster like a tornado, earthquake, hazardous materials, something of that nature. Um, but like I said, there's a lot we want to do and we'd love to do. We have another partner where we are in early discussions about a trauma therapy tool for children, their parents or guardians, and understand. Kind of imagine a scale. Something simplistic for a child that can be monitored through therapist activity for sessions and story-based telling. Now we go into parent modules and guardian modules that help them understand how to cope and support. Now
Interesting.
moving into your advocacy group, your applied research group, everything else. There's certainly a way that data analytics compared to gamification can support multiple lanes, and we would love to tackle all of those, and we're really hungry to get into it. But first and
Yeah.
foremost, let's gain some traction, get this out there, and get more users wanting to use it.
Right. Yeah. It definitely seems like there's a lot of possibilities in these multi domains. So are there any low-hanging fruit partnerships or collaborations that you're willing to discuss that CRLT is involved in?
I wish I could. I'm actually in non-disclosure agreements, but let's hint it
Gotcha.
this way: we are in major discussions with a university that will that scale of approach I talked about
Hmm.
would give us the academic to state level. We have several ISDs, independent school districts, with their own police department or county level law enforcement support that are interested, and we'll tie that into one particular state where we'll start approaching and encouraging the education agency to link in the schools to their local law enforcement, link it to this state level academic program. And then we can start linking in, well, what's the opposite side? Well, now we can start looking at what it means to a DHS and CISA at the federal level, to gaining the information and seeing if, what's the value and worth of expanding, training via remote gamification capabilities. So that's one.
Yeah, that's
We are
exciting.
looking at, a nonprofit organization, what it means to the trauma care, as I indicated, and we're looking at another one where we would do a state level enterprise for a nonprofit that has 40 facilities in the state that, and they don't really have emergency management education to speak of, and we want to support them with that.
Yeah, really, really sounds like you're helping a lot of organizations out. So, if an organization is interested in a full demo or further information about the product, what would their next steps be?
Well, first and foremost is, take a look at our website and see in combination with that at www.crisisresponse.tech, TECH. Look at the background information, and then there should be a hover on. If you're sitting there for more than 10 seconds, we're going to hammer you about, hey, schedule a demo. And it's kind of going to just send out a request for information that will come back to the staff and say, hey, this person's interested in a demonstration. And then we'll look to get you onto a calendar. The next and almost faster way is to look at our YouTube channel. We've got, CRLT Incorporated in YouTube, and we've got a lot of videos that will really give you a good understanding of where we are and where we want to go. And if you like that, look for me on LinkedIn. I respond to every single person because I just love what we're doing that much. I want to talk to everybody. So if you DM me on LinkedIn, we'll put you in as soon as the calendar is available, and we'll do a private discussion and remote demonstration for you. And we can do that in 20 to 40 minute with Q&A. And I would say those are best. And if you want to follow us, we do a lot of, traction via LinkedIn messaging. We try to put out content for the community, probably 3 to 4 days a week. We're on Instagram, and we do have a small Facebook presence. And those just really help. The more people we get to there, the more we'll understand where our interests and where we can go. But we're pretty small, and we're highly interested to talk to every single person. So if you just reach out to me directly, Tod Langley on LinkedIn, that's probably the second best way to get a hold of us.
Yeah, and that's so true because that's how we connected was via LinkedIn messaging. I had shot you a message because I had looked into your training simulation and wanted to connect more and discuss and get my hands on, and play test. So I appreciate your time, Tod.
Yeah, like I said, I talk a lot, but I'm very enthusiastic about what the team has created. We're very proud of what they did, and we consider you a part of that team, and providing us all of your technical feedback and assessments. So, and with this again, thanks for the opportunity for me to talk once more, and I look forward to where it goes from here.
Yeah, awesome. All right, thanks.